Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider Series. Today is going to be very special. As always, we bring top practitioners from corporate venturing, from different journeys into corporate venturing. Today we have Debra Brackeen, who is a Chief Innovation Officer for CSAA. Welcome, Debra.
Thank you, Nicolas. I'm very excited to be here with you today.
Would you mind maybe spending 5 to 10 minutes to describe your journey into corporate venturing?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and honestly one that I've reflected on quite a bit over the years. I've been doing stuff for like 30 years now, so I'm on the latter stage of my career. But I would say that a lot of it goes back personally to my father, which I never would have admitted in my younger years. My father was an aerospace engineer, and he worked for Martin Marietta. He became an executive, and in a very stodgy, old, staid, industry, he was very entrepreneurial, and he ended up working on and leading many programs for Martin that are, I guess you could put them in the experimental category. So, for example, he spent years working on this thing called the X-24B, and I got to go to the wind tunnel with him a few times and see the little models get tested there. And it was I think it's called a lifting body, and it was really a prototype for the space shuttle to figure out how do you direct a re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere and a landing in a designated point when something's flying back in from outer space, basically. He also worked on something called Skylab, which was an MVP, or an early version of what's now known as the International Space Station. I think he even worked on both of the Viking missions to Mars back in the day. So that, kind of, I suppose, inspired me, even though I didn't realize it at the time, to be thinking big, thinking beyond, and just, really, as I did enter the workforce and we had conversations once I became a young professional, that just really has inspired me, and still to this day it does. He's been gone a long time, but it really does inspire me. Professionally, I think maybe from my dad, I don't know, but I've always been drawn to, the next new kind of cool thing. I actually had the opportunity to start working at Apple when I was still at Stanford, and that turned into like a 10-year career at Apple. And Apple at I'm dating myself, but this is like 30 years ago, but Apple at the time was nowhere near as dominant as they are now. They were like the David to IBM's Goliath. And so I got to work on a number. It was very entrepreneurial. It really supported, let's say, non-conformist type of thinking. I think in the early days, you didn't even have to have an engineering degree to be hired as a programmer there. It's just very, very, grassroots. But the last 2 years that I worked there, I had the opportunity to be in the Newton division. And for anyone old enough to remember, Newton was an original personal digital assistant. The chipset in it is the ARM chipset, which is really the basis for almost all smartphones today and more. But the part of Newton that I got to run, we licensed the operating system. We enabled third-party developers and other hardware manufacturers to build different forms of Newton devices. For me, it was really kind of a love of business model innovation, because we never licensed the Macintosh operating system by design, and I was always worried that that limited our market scope. Turned out not to be true, 30 some odd years later. But I think somewhere in all of that, my inspiration from my dad, my early experience at Apple. I mean, I even in the Mac business, I ran developer programs and worked on those. And who are developers? Third-party developers are often entrepreneurs, startups, creating their own businesses in and around platform ecosystems, like the Apple, like the Mac, like the Newton OS. So I think that just really instilled in me this love of the Silicon Valley ecosystem. And every job I've ever taken has really been about working with people that I am inspired by, can learn from, and I have something to contribute. But the first 15, 20 years of my career were in high tech, and I only recently shifted over in the last 10 plus years to financial services, first at City Ventures, and then more recently, last 5 years at CSAA. So, I think I feel lucky in the last 15 years, starting at HP, then Citi, and now at CSAA, that I've been able to make a career out of really specializing in corporate innovation and venture. But I think it was those seeds of entrepreneurial spirit and thinking that I was exposed to early on that landed me where I am.
Very nice. I think one word you've said a lot, which I think matters so much, is inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we will touch on that. There's also something I want to double click, which I think is the first time in this series someone mentioned it, was a David and Goliath. And in a way, betting on entrepreneurs is all about picking the David and making them as successful and increasing their probability of success to win against Goliath. So how much of your experience in Apple in that kind of frame? Indeed, this is not the Apple of today. Today it would be the Goliath, but at the time, this was clearly a David. How much of that frame your mind into how you look at entrepreneurs today?
I mean, I don't think it can be overstated how much it's influenced my thinking. And actually it goes back to my father as well. As I was saying, he, very smart guy, but he was always the one with the crazy idea to go after some new market or new business, which was at the time seemingly, somewhere between, perceived as impossible or completely crazy. And I think that was very true of almost everything that we did when I was at Apple. And yet the culture back then was so amazing to be part of, from my point of view. In that, it had a hierarchy and all of that, but it was kind of, it was very amenable to somebody saying, like, shouldn't we be thinking about XYZ? And the response was typically, that's a really good idea. You should go do that. Like, it was just much more nonconformist. I can't think of a better word. But yeah, I mean, think about what startup founders, they are literally challenging incumbents.
Yep.
In typically well-established, much better capitalized, industries, and it on the surface seems kind of crazy, and yet I believe that the venture-backed startup ecosystem is really what's fueling the majority of innovation today. I mean, when I started, all the big tech companies had labs, advanced tech. We had an advanced technology lab at Apple. Bell Labs is a storied, version of that. HP Labs, IBM Labs, and there are still labs, but for whatever set of reasons, they're not churning out the innovation and the new businesses at the same pace, clearly, that the venture ecosystem is.
I like when you mentioned about nonconformist, and in a way, it probably touched a little bit on the value of building a contrarian view of what the future could be that not many people see.
Exactly.
I also think the way you were describing it is nearly like you want to create a context, a culture where you have a license to try something new.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's double click on the nonconformist or contrarian view. I'm not actually, how much do you see the nonconformist part touching on the contrarian view of the future?
Well, at least for me, I'd see them, fairly similarly. It might just be because I kind of view myself as a nonconformist in many ways, but I certainly on the contrarian, perspective, I believe in that, kind of ethos, especially relative to venture investing. High conviction, low consensus. I've heard Ben Horowitz talk about, ventures like being in the business of finding secrets, which I think is just another way of saying the same thing. Not everybody, I have the privilege in my role of living, at least mentally, in the future a lot, the Jetsons future, and as I like to say, and autonomous vehicles. So, my company is for over 100 years been writing personal auto insurance policies. And, we've sold effectively to the same customer, AAA members, the same AAA, auto insurance policy through same channel, AAA clubs.
Yeah.
When I started 5 years ago, I also lead strategy. I was new to the insurance industry, but, Lyft and Uber were already fairly well established. So the sharing economy was already here now. And, massive amounts of capital were being invested into autonomous vehicle companies. And, when I thought about just the changes in mobility, there were questions back then, are millennials even going to own cars? Do they even need to learn, do younger people even need to learn how to drive? And to me, just strategically, I'm like, the future is about fleets.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're going to be, consuming accessing mobility services as opposed to driving ourselves around and insuring ourselves, we need a different business model. And so one of the first things my team did was, and it's now a successful 2-year corporate startup. We have a commercial insurer called Mobilitas. And that was really all from this perspective of, yeah, autonomous vehicles aren't really 100% here now everywhere, but they're going to be. And, we want a way that we can play in that new or future emerging ecosystem. And so now we've started Mobilitas. It's we're close to our, hitting the 100 million in revenue mark for that business.
Oh, wow.
It's really exciting for an internal startup. And one of the big TNC companies is one of our biggest partners. We just won a deal with Cruise, which is one of the AV players that I'm super excited about. But when I started those conversations internally, we need to diversify into commercial insurance. I mean, you have to have some good fortitude and resilience to stand in the face of everybody telling you you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. And I didn't about insurance. I was new to that conversation, but to me, strategically, it was really clear. And I think you have to have a perspective on the future and a rationale as to why. I mean, and you can't just, you can't live in a fantasy. There's a difference between that and a point of view about the future that isn't here yet, or isn't, there's the saying, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So I think you're always looking for those early signals and a hypothesis about how they're going to develop over time that, represents that future vision. And to me, that's, and that example happened to be a corporate innovation example. But I think the same is true for startups. They have a perspective about something that isn't here today or isn't working as well as it should today that can be better, and they're going after it.
So what I find fascinating about the story, insurance indeed hasn't changed for 100 years. But you can see things are going to change. You're going to end up with cars where you go inside, there is no driver. Mm-hmm. The driver was kind of your reassurance that there is a guarantee the driver is going to be careful not to have an accident because he's in the car. But you're not from insurance, you're from the technology space in a way. That must have taken courage or vision for the CEO of CSAA to choose someone from outside insurance to come and understand what the disruption could look like. Can you talk about the value of someone who's from the outside the industry when the industry is looking like it will be disrupted versus someone who's been in the industry for a long time?
Yes, I could definitely talk about that. I mean, that is, that's why I was hired. And to the credit of it was the former CEO. I have a new CEO now, last 3 years, but the CEO who hired me, she and the board, frankly, had the vision and the wisdom to assess there's disruption, on the horizon for CSAA, and we know we need to innovate and address it. And you can't wait for it to be here already when you're trying to address it, because then you're already behind the proverbial 8 ball. So they created this role, and I think had a bias to hire somebody externally to bring that outside in perspective. And, you know, I think I learned this when I was at HP. I ran corporate ventures when I was there, which was a combination of new business incubation and engaging with the external startup ecosystem and investors as well. That I think that's where I started to realize I had this perspective of I might not know a particular industry or business. And I think I learned it the first time I partnered with our printing and imaging business at HP. But that I could I am a quick study. I love learning. I love learning new things, especially, you know, it's like, you know, it's like I can learn what I need to know about a new industry, and specifically going back to that business model comment earlier. I just kind of like, how does this business model work? Like, what's the value chain? Where is the money, you know, flowing, and how can you tweak that? And the technology pieces, technologies often change the economics of different value chains and business models. So you can kind of play with that. So for me, it's like a fun playground. But, you know, I would say to your question, that I think, like a startup, you know, founder trying to attack a big incumbent, coming in new to an industry that I didn't really understand, I'm unfettered with legacy mindset.
Yep.
You know, what I saw was, here's all these things that are really kind of inefficiencies and or friction points that I'm sure, you know, were long standing in the industry that just got accepted because that for what, you know, whenever they tried to fix them, they were too hard to fix and they never got prioritized. I mean, those are great entry points for startup founders. For me, it's just, you can bring that fresh mindset and perspective. And if you have to have, you know, the fortitude to go up against people. I've had a lot of people tell me that's a really, I actually had somebody, I won't name any names, but one of my peers, when I first introduced the idea of diversifying into commercial at CSAA, he actually said verbatim, that is the least innovative idea I've ever heard. You know, and so, but I really did have the conviction of my perspective, that I could ground in some data. It was new emerging data, and an assessment about where it was heading directionally. But yeah, I think I really applaud, you know, the board and the CEO at the time for having the foresight to bring somebody in who, you know, brought a different perspective. It's sort of like inviting somebody to challenge you. Sometimes I had to remind people that that's why I was brought in, but that's okay.
So I want to ask about the interview itself. And the way I see it is, for senior people, when you go and interview for a role, it's about making sure you have an alignment of vision. Mm-hmm. And if you do, and you are very explicit during the interviews what you plan to do, then you automatically have a license to execute on what you said you were going to do. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the discussions you had and the vision you put together during the interview, and how you then executed on it?
I do. You know, I think because it was, you know, this role has been sort of my third tour of duty, leading innovation and venturing, and at 3 big companies, or, you know, 2 prior big companies, HP and Citi. And so, you know, there's the school of hard knocks, right? Just I learned, both experiences at HP and Citi really informed my perspective on what I wanted to get alignment on, and make sure we, you know, it was, here's what I believe you're going to need to put in place, whether you hire me or not, you know?
High conviction.
Yes. And that included a venture investing arm. You know, it included, I did have alignment with the CEO as well on, you know, it's not just about an innovation department over there, that's doing some really cool stuff. It's about building an innovative company and culture. And, you know, the important, in my case, because I lead both strategy and innovation, the alignment of, like, for the sake of what are we innovating or investing, for that matter, it's to drive the future of the business, to grow the business. And so the linkage and alignment to the strategy, could not be more important. And they don't have to be under one leader. In my case, they are, but I call it the happy marriage, because it's really, if you just innovating over there, even if you think you're linked to strategy, sometimes there's the NIH problem, not invented here, and so I think that's challenging. But some of the things I was very explicit about, I want to have an emerging tech lab, because to my earlier comment, at Citi, we started the blockchain work, and there's probably nothing that there's no technology that could be more disruptive to banking in financial services than crypto and blockchain at the time. And we were really early, and it was very experimental, and we were trying to figure out what we should be focused on. Everybody thought when I was hired at CSAA, what are we going to do with blockchain? I was like, I don't think it's ready for insurance yet. But AI and machine learning, what are we doing there? Because that's really where we need to be playing.
Yeah.
So, and venture investing, as I said, was I think it's just a crucial tool in the toolbox of corporate innovation.
I love your mention about tour of duties. Could you tell me one of the big takeaway you had from HP and big takeaway you had from Citi that you brought into your current role?
Oh boy.
And they can't be the same takeaway.
Yeah. I think at HP, it was really, I think that's where I learned that I needed to have that backbone, that fortitude, that ability to stand in the face of a senior executive, and it happened more than once, telling me, you don't need to do that. That's on my roadmap. I've got it. And also the courage to be, I guess I can say this because I've been gone long enough, and now the company's split up. So, but there was, I can think of one example in particular with an executive who said exactly that to me, because we had been incubating a new business. It was a web services based business model, and that executive was absolutely the right executive to be the sponsor of it and to do it. But knowing at a big company that somebody says it's on my roadmap, it's probably not going to happen, this year, maybe not even next year, maybe not even in 2 years. And just, the courage to say, we're going to keep developing this business because there's learning and insights to be gleaned from it. That guy might ultimately, say no, or maybe we're not going to be successful. Maybe we'll find something else, pivot to something that is more successful. But, I think the takeaway from HP, at the time, they weren't actively investing in startups. We had a lot of startup investments, and I hired an investor to help clean them up. We had too many. There's no way to say they were strategic because there were just too many. And we had been highly acquisitive, and that's how we got a lot of them. But, that in a way informed my perspective of the importance of venture investing alongside innovation, because we couldn't quite muster at that time, a focused approach at doing it. But what I really learned from HP was, to trust myself and my instincts about when to proceed with something, even when others were telling me not to do it. At Citi, I think I would say it's hard. There's so many takeaways from Citi, but I guess one of the big ones, lean startup wasn't really a big thing. I think I don't remember the precise year when Eric's book came out, but I think it was when I was at Citi, and those practices, and I think Steve Blank had been teaching that even before Eric's book came out, through his work at Stanford and Berkeley and elsewhere. But I think the practices and the mindset around lean startup, minimum viable product, and test and learn, and kind of more iterative approach, which I think, by the way, is it's very, to me, it's very analogous to venture stage investing, right? You're kind of stage gating things, and it's like, show me that you can get to this next key milestone. the discipline of that. And we did one of the programs that I helped found at Citi is I believe it's way bigger now. It's called D10X. It was Discover 10X, as in Discover 10X growth, and very much built on the principles of venture investing.
I won't double click on Lean Startup because I'm passionate about it and I've deployed it in my previous organization, so it would take a 1 hour. But let me double click on the HP executive, but not that example, but more the need for championship or not for making investments. Because sometimes it could be very valuable to have championship because then you can actually support the entrepreneur and add value. But sometimes it could mean that it's a filter, a restriction, a bias. How did you think about this championship of different business groups, business units, executives when you want to make an investment?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's a really big issue. You know, I think a lot of in fact, one of my former team members from HP is leading venture investing at HP, the PC company, PC printer company today. And we've talked about this quite a bit. When you're in a situation where you require a business unit leader to effectively sponsor, sign off, approve, whatever word you want to use, but if they have any authority over that process, I just personally think that's a real hindrance to many things. It's a hindrance to your literal investment process. It's probably a factor for who's going to be, what talent's going to be willing to join your investment team. You know, I think venture investors as a category are pretty, independent, autonomous, minded people. So I was lucky to have 2 board members at CSAA who were part of my interview process. One is a Silicon Valley, veteran and mainstay, and the other is an entrepreneur, happens to be out of Utah. But they've been our venture advisors since we got approval for Avanta Ventures in my first year, and I aligned with one of those, the Silicon Valley veteran, very early on, as I was I think before I really started developing the proposal that I had to pitch to the board to get the first fund approved. And it was that we cannot have like BU approval. Now we consider ourselves strategic investors. I mean, we have professional investors running Avanta, so they know. And if you ask them, they'd say, of course, we're trying to produce a financial return, which I appreciate because then you're going to make a good investment. I mean, if you invest in a company because it's cool and it's not a good financial investment, you're not going to get any strategic value out of it anyway.
Exactly.
So, but I think you gotta, a big part of my role is that, I don't know what the right word is. I'm the liaison. I'm running interference. I'm creating the conditions and kind of protecting, if you will, our venture arm from too much stupid stuff from the bureaucracy or the mothership. But I'm also influencing them and coaching them. Like, you can't be completely, like running around like a crazy team over there and maintain the support of the parent company. So like finding the governance and this that everybody can get comfortable with, I think is really important. And I mean, that's probably been one of my biggest areas of focus the last 5 years with Avanta is just the right governance and structure and processes that allow them to do what they are great at. And that our board, because we report to, every quarter we give an Avanta update to the, F&I committee of our board. We just did it earlier this week. And my CEO and partners on the investment committee from the firm. That's just, it's crucial that you have that set up right and structured well. But I believe part of a really important thing, if there was a tip for your audience, it's I think it's better if you can get a policy and a governance process that allows the investment team to invest within those agreed parameters without BU approval. But you also have to, and the venture team and I also invest in what are the other things we need to be doing so that when we take one of our portfolio companies to a business unit, that they are open to
open arms
to partner with them, because that's why we're investing, is to create commercial value mutually with our portfolio companies for the benefit of our customers.
And this is beyond governance. This is actually probably about building trust, building goodwill, and also showing that you're bringing strategic value. And in our previous conversation, you talked about some of your publications that you have that is shared internally. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this is one step towards building trust and understanding of the strategic value. Could you share with the audience a little of your tips, what you've learned about what you're publishing internally that can really go a long way?
Yeah, so that was probably the hardest part, by the way, of getting approval. Even though I sort of pre-sold it in my interview process and joining CSAA, I started in November of 2016, and I had pegged in my mind, I want to make my proposal for the venture arm, in the June board meeting the next year. And if I don't get it quite right and they send me back to do more homework, I'll do it again in the September board meeting. But we were lucky to get approval in the first board meeting. But part of the pitch process to the board, which was not an easy sell, was, why are we doing this? We're doing it for the strategic insights and learnings that will inform our strategy and influence our strategy as we think about how the world. So it's a channel to bring the outside in and make it relevant and meaningful for the board and for my colleagues, and then ultimately the commercial value that you're hopeful to achieve with your portfolio companies if you can. So that took a lot of explaining, frankly, to the board. Like, what do you mean by strategic insights? So when I hired Sanjeev Parikh is the managing partner of Avanta Ventures, and he and I worked together at HP as well. So we've known each other a long time. I said we need to find some sort of formal way to share, to capture, synthesize, and share these strategic insights. And as everybody in your audience knows, right, for any one investment you made, you've probably met hundreds of companies, and so and there's a lot of strategic exhaust that comes out of that process of meeting all those companies. The investors are forming opinions about, I'm going to make an investment in this area. I'm just trying to figure out the right one. So being able to really distill and synthesize, that's the best phrase I can come up with, insights in a way that's relevant for our board and my peers on the executive leadership team and our senior leaders. You got to have good writing talent, by the way. We've learned, and thankfully our Avanta team does. But we took, I don't know, we probably had a few like MVP versions, like do people like this, and it's too long, and getting it just right. I think but we've published now, I think for 3.5 years, every quarter, probably somewhere in the vicinity of a 25-30 page Word document on those strategic insights. And we usually pick 2 or 3 topics. And by the way, the Avanta team does this. I don't approve anything. They pick which trends they want to highlight. In this last issue, I think it was an update on mobility. Mobility is one of our investment focus areas and a huge part of our personal lines business and all of our commercial business today. So, and there's a lot going on in mobility, so that's a rich space. And I think we talked about the fintech as a strategic adjacency to a lot of insurance use cases that are interesting to us. And there's a lot going on there. Just like there's embedded finance is a trend, embedded insurance is kind of a trend. But we really the team for every Monday partner meeting where they're debating and discussing whether we're going to make a particular investment, all of that, those conversations and all of the conversations they have with the different startups that they meet with, and winnow down to the ones they want to, try and close on, inform their perspective about a part of our market or a future market, that might be relevant to our future. We do kind of use the Horizon 1, 2, 3 framework,
I see.
So some things are kind of closer in here and now, and some things are more future oriented. And we've reinforced that with our leadership team, so they kind of and the board, so they kind of understand that we can be in any one of those 3 time horizons. But I will tell you, I think we're distributing that insights report to several hundred people at this point internally, and our company's about 3,800 employees. It's in the board materials every quarter, because we just had a meeting 2 days ago with the board. The chair of our board said again to Sanjeev and I how valuable, and she specifically commented on the just how strategically relevant and insightful that report is, and she reads it every single time. I know our CEO reads it every single time, and we have obviously the majority of the people who receive it are in our company, but I'm really glad that we've done it. And for me, also leading strategy for the company, I find it very informative as well. I mean, it's a different way to contribute to strategy.
I think this is a golden nugget, which is publish your learnings, your insights internally, especially when it's highly relevant. You're going to get a lot of engagements, responses, goodwill. And so you do it once a quarter, which is, it takes discipline. One thing you said, which I want to really highlight, because I think it's important and it's so often misunderstood by people who are not in corporate venturing, is that it's not from the startup you invest that you learn. Of course, you learn from them, but it's from the hundreds of startups you looked into a given space that you actually can aggregate learnings into and distill it. And I think you use a better word than this, but to get to the insights that then you can share.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I'm sure there's always learnings from any one startup, but I think for me, I mentioned we started the blockchain work when I was at Citi, and I remember very distinctly. I read a lot. You have to read a lot in this business, and it was before Andreessen wrote, why Bitcoin's going to change the world, or whatever that editorial he wrote was. And I was like, oh, he's a pretty smart guy.
Yep.
Understatement. Yep. And then I just started getting these little, myself, just through my own reading, these little hits, something's kind of bubbling up. And then I happened to be in Tel Aviv, I don't know, a few months later, visiting with our lab there. And the lab had set up some meetings for me with a couple of universities who were really interested in talking about Bitcoin. And it was all about Bitcoin. I think this was, I don't remember what year, maybe 2014. Nobody was really talking about blockchain yet at the time. And it was before the Mt. Gox thing got blown up. But, I think you just sort of, that's just me. And I'm not meeting hundreds of startups, as an active investor. But that is what investors do. They're talking to all these startups, and often a lot of people in my experience, have a similar idea about a similar opportunity at the same time. So you just get this amazing, kind of, it's like having a probe in the market, and the probe is creating data, but data in and of itself isn't that useful unless you can, synthesize it into something meaningful, which might just be a hypothesis, as opposed to a hard trend at the time. But I think that's a hugely invaluable, thing that comes out of the act of having a venture program.
And your BOD, your board of directors, feedback that this is insightful and helps them think. It's interesting that when you were interviewing, they wonder what's the value, and now they really see the value.
Well, hopefully, yes. But it's yeah, it's kind of hard to, like, you know, we're going to deploy capital to get strategic insights. I mean, that can be a hard sell, right? But
Yeah.
you got to follow it up with the other. We have a little pyramid of how do you create value from the venture investing activity, and you know, the real value comes when, and we now have that, so that helps people appreciate the strategic insights report, because we have real examples of portfolio companies that are delivering revenue for us, and you know,
You have the success stories now.
Exactly. Yeah, and in fact, one of them is, I mentioned Mobilitas, our commercial arm. We have a last mile delivery insurance product called M Fleet, Mobilitas Fleet product, and one of our portfolio companies is InShare. It's an MGA, and they are the primary broker and producer of all M Fleet revenue on behalf of Mobilitas.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, so and I mean, they probably produced, I would say, close to maybe slightly over 10% of all of Mobilitas's revenue last year. So, you know, to me, that's where it all comes together. You know, you invest in a company who has a vision. You know, part of our diligence process and discussion at the investment committee for every company we invest in is, what's the strategic, you know, relevance and potential value that a partnership with this company can bring us and our customers. And in that case, you know, it's been amazingly successful to date. So that's how you have to you have to back it up. I think if all we ever did was produce the strategic insights report, maybe the chair of our board wouldn't be making those comments.
Or maybe they would become impatient. But I think you just described one of the best examples I've ever heard of companies that you invest in, the outside in, working with an internal startup, which is meant to be inside out,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure some parts of your business as well.
Yes.
Which one? So the chicken and egg, which one would you start with if you could choose?
Well, that's hard for me. It's a hard question for me to answer, only because I am so passionate about the importance of us having a meaningful business in the emerging mobility ecosystem. So both, it's asked me to pick which of my two children do I love more, Nicolas.
Yeah, no, you want both. You want both. But the fact you've managed to have both and synergies between them, I think, is what makes it really beautiful.
It is pretty exciting. I have to confess. And you know, I mean, I will say that a challenge is they're both startups. And so that has its own inherent challenges in this particular, you know, set of examples. Mobilitas is very much a startup business internally. And that means, you know, like the headcount that is part of that business, they're still leveraging a whole bunch of other resources internally, different shared services, people, you know, we're trying to keep the core team small and scrappy, and we're trying to hire the right best talent as that business scales. And then the same is true for InShare. I mean, they're a startup, you know, externally. And so partnering between two startups has its own, I guess, inherent challenges. So if there was one, it might be easier if one of them was more mature.
I think you've managed to change my mind, or at least to challenge my opinion on this. My opinion was, so I started the corporate VC of TDK Ventures, and then there was an opportunity to start the incubator inside and to be driven by me. And my view was, this is such a different skill set. And when you wake up in the morning, it's a different focus. I felt like it should be a different team. And I was glad to find a team that wanted to drive it, and they're driving it really well. But now I can see also some value to have the teams under the same reporting line to create these synergies that may actually not be necessarily the focus otherwise.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, somewhere along the way in my own personal journey, I think maybe this was another insight from HP. When I started at HP, I was primarily doing just the incubation thing. And then, I realized there's this guy over there, and he's sort of this one-man liaison to the VC startup ecosystem. And it's like, that seems kind of like synergistic. Maybe we should work more closely together. And then, there was yet someone else who was sort of overseeing this increasingly large and growing set of equity investments that we had, and were kept acquiring. We kept growing because we were acquiring new companies that had their own equity investments, and convinced my boss to pull that all together under, corporate ventures, to try and extract some synergies. And I think we did a little bit of that, but I that strengthened my perspective that I actually, when you only have one tool in your innovation toolbox, you're only looking for, if you have a hammer, you're looking for a nail.
Yep.
So I personally have arrived at a perspective that it's better to have all the tools there, and then and an opportunity like the future of mobility services, right, is you actually don't want just one. I don't want
You
just
want the full spectrum.
yeah. And so it doesn't always work. I mean, to be perfectly honest, and even in my small division across the different functions, it's easy for anybody to get just focused on what they are doing. So that's part of my role, is to try to, where appropriate, encourage people to talk across the functional lines to see if we can improve the outcomes. But yeah, I think they're both really important personally.
Talking about people speaking and having the opportunity to speak, I want to also touch on something you haven't mentioned in your introduction, but you were very early on diversity and inclusion, which I want to treat as two different topics.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share a little bit about your view of diversity today and what you think we could do better as an ecosystem?
Yes, thank you. I did forget to mention that in my intro. Yeah, for whatever reason, I've always been passionate about diversity, and back to the Apple days. And this is actually an example of one of the things I mentioned, where somebody said, yeah, we should just go do that. A friend and I, the friend happened to be Eastern Indian. Somehow, I don't remember what started it, but we got in this pretty philosophical and serious conversation about diversity. And we didn't have the language at the time, but a lot of what we talked about was unconscious bias. That when we were hiring for talent at Apple back then, we used to have this thing called the Apple fit. We were looking, and it was this kind of intangible quality. Are they part of the Apple fit? And when most of your company is white males, the Apple fit can look a lot like you. And actually that probably was how we ended up talking about it, because sometimes when you're looking for good, consciously or unconsciously, you're probably looking for things that you possess, as opposed to deliberately looking for things that perhaps balance out your shortcomings. Not everybody's aware of their shortcomings. So long story short, we ended up documenting, we inventoried like all the different employee resource groups for some reason that I don't fully recall, like Apple Pride and the Black Employees Association, whatever we had. And then we had this sort of philosophical thing that we were writing about what we felt was important to challenge ourselves and each other to be mindful of diversity. And this is like before the internet, and we ended up printing this thing, but we had a printer. We were in the printer business then, and we had this printed version that was getting shared around, like literally went viral on paper, if you can believe it. And
yes, viral on paper is
so with the Apple HR actually asked our permission to publish it, and it became the first Apple Diversity Handbook. And then separately but related, I also was invited to be part of the team that pitched the Apple Board of Directors to support then domestic partner benefits for same-sex couples, because gay marriage at the time was not a thing, not yet legal. And those are on reflection, 30 years later, right? Two of the things I'm really most proud of, and I've just always had a really strong, I very frequently at Apple found myself to be the only woman in the room, and often like the person leading the meeting, because I was a program manager, helped ship products and stuff. And, you know, it's lonely sometimes. I mean, and on the one hand, I didn't let it kind of hold me back, but, you know, I've just felt really strongly about increasing diversity my whole career. Later today, I'm an executive sponsor at my company for the Women's Professional Network, and we're having a meeting with the co-leads later today. It's part of why I joined the company at CSAA is our commitment to diversity and inclusion. And I think it's so important in innovation and venturing. Relative to your question about our industry and specifically venture investing, I think it's fair to say, and it's hard to disagree, that we have a lot of opportunity to do way better. It's probably been one of the industries, you know, not getting on the bandwagon maybe as soon as we might have hoped. And one of the great things about having a leadership role with Avanta Ventures is I can influence what we do there, and we know that Avanta team knows we can help be influential with our other co-investors and our portfolio companies. So we are deeply committed to. I don't think you can make a difference if you don't kind of know where you're at. So we, you know, I'm a big fan of metrics. We track. I mean, the Avanta team itself is very diverse. We track and report on the diversity, women and people of color of our portfolio companies, of our studios companies. And we even have boilerplate that in this last year or so, we've started dropping into our deal documents where we assert, we share our commitment to diversity and inclusion and why it's important, and encourage our portfolio companies to track and report. And we're hopeful that they also embrace it. It's non-binding at this stage, but it's something we can do. We partner with other companies that share our commitment. When we do events and co-sponsor things, we try to do that with folks like Startup Runway or Culture Shift Labs, other entities that really share a commitment to diversity. Very
nice. You mentioned it's not binding at this time. Do you see a point where it actually would be valuable to be binding?
Well, maybe, I think, or maybe it doesn't need to be. You know, like that would be nirvana. You know, you don't. It just is happening. I think we have to be more deliberate about it. You know, I think maybe is my best answer. I don't know. I think it's been surprising for some folks. Other people are like, yeah, absolutely. We're totally committed to this. No problem. So I think it depends.
It opens the dialogue, which I think is one of the important steps.
Exactly.
And I really appreciate you said maybe, because I find many people having such strong opinions, nearly binary, and your maybe answer is very refreshing. So I really appreciate that. The next topic is inclusion. Once you've done well on diversity, which is great, it's no point to have diversity if actually you don't include these different voices. Right. What would be your view on enabling better inclusion? I find this to be much more difficult to understand and to have good best practices. So your insight would be really helpful.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think it's harder. You know, I think as a leader, as a people leader in the organization, you know, I try to always be mindful when. Well, I'll give you a very pragmatic, simplistic example. And my company is we've had a long before I joined, deep commitment to diversity and inclusion, which as I said, is part of why I joined. And but still, you know, it still happens where our communications team is working with the CEO and my head of strategy, like maybe the CEO is going to do a town hall with the whole company virtually. These days it's been virtual. And so there's slides that get created or a little animated video. And I did this recently. I'm often the one that's saying, could the first 4 examples of the animated humans be of different ethnicity, like different colors, different skin colors? And because it's easy when you're, doing this stuff people just don't see certain things. We did a cute little graphic for our Destination 2030 strategy that we rolled out in 2020. And it's very futuristic. It's got like flying taxis and, things. And there's a few little humans in there. And the first version of that, that it all looked like kind of white guys. And so that's a very basic thing. And why do I do that? Because I notice it, and I know other women or people of color notice it if they don't see themselves in those images. Yep. And in one sense, they don't seem very important, but I feel personally, as my one small little tiny commitment to inclusion, that if others can't see themselves in it, you've already lost them, in some way, or at least part of them, their commitment, their spirit, whatever. And part of inclusion is, there's the phrase, we want people to be able to, bring their whole selves to work. And I think, your whole self, what does that mean? To me, it means everybody has very different lived experiences, and I want as much diversity and variety of lived experiences and perspectives in the room when we're trying to make a decision. That's not an easy decision. And so, those are, as a people leader in a room, lately it's been virtual rooms. I try, and it's harder virtually, actually, try to make sure that everybody's getting called on and everybody has a chance to, so if some people are just more naturally quiet, like regardless of what they may look like,
Yep.
Just make sure we're calling on that person. Hey, Victor, you haven't said anything. Just curious, what do you think about this?
Hearing everyone's voice, I think, is, I wish we could spend way more time on this topic, but we only have 3 minutes left. And I want to ask you about, where are you on your fund status? And also, where do you see yourself investing in the next year or so that gets you really passionate about?
Fund status. Well, we are at the end of our kind of active investing cycle in Fund 1. So we're in the, I guess, 5th year at this point. And I'm happy to say that the board was enthusiastically supportive of Fund 2. So we got approval for that at the end of
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it's about 3x the size of Fund 1. So and part of that is a strategy to focus on we've been investing primarily Series A, early Series B. We wanted the ability to write slightly larger checks, invest in slightly more mature Series B companies to accelerate our ability to partner with them commercially. What am I excited about investing in? I get excited about a lot of different investments. I think I'm really excited about right now embedded insurance and actually investments that might be outside of insurance, but that are strategic adjacencies that will allow us to partner, like maybe different opportunities for distribution, embedded insurance, and that kind of thing. I think
I have to stop you. I don't know what embedded insurance means.
Well, I think so if you think about how insurance works today, you buy a new car. It's hard to buy a new car right now, or a used car, and you have to separately acquire your insurance.
Oh, I see.
In the future, does your insurance just kind of come automatically as part of the car, or anything that you might buy that you insure? That could be true of.
I see.
Again, it's a business model thing. I'm always like interested in the business model.
Very, very nice. Debbie, it was really nice having you today. I think your passion is obvious and your insights are many. So thank you so much. And hopefully the audience learned as much as I did. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Nicolas. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.